I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. The new school year has begun, and one thing you will start to hear soon about is student mental health. Concern about youth mental health long precedes the pandemic. Though, like everything else, COVID has made this harder as well. I called an old friend of mine, child psychiatrist and University of Illinois faculty member Niranjan Karnik, who directs the Institute of Juvenile Research in Chicago, perhaps the first dedicated center for the study of youth behavior in the United States. And I asked him why youth mental health has become such a growing concern. Prior to the pandemic, youth suicides were up. Students were self-reporting anxiety and depression and demanding services be made available to them. There was and is growing concern about social media use, including bullying over various platforms.
Oh, had I a golden thread and needle oh, so fine, I'd weave a magic band of rainbow design, of rainbow design. In it I would weave the bravery of women.
If you're new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County climate band, the Sunshiners. Kippen Martin on guitar and vocals, Rick Sullivan on vocals and guitar, and Jeffrey Weisner on the double bass. They released their first album, Endangered Species, on the podcast on Earth Day 2022.
This sorry world through hand and heart and mind, hand and heart and mind. Far over the water, I'd reach my magic band to every human being, so they would understand, so they'd understand. Oh, had I
Public schools in the Washington, D.C. region reopened this week. Gaithersburg City Council member Neil Harris wrote on Facebook about how one particular school that opened its doors for the first time this year came into being. Here he is reading his post.
There was just a ribbon cutting at the brand new Harriet Tubman Elementary School in Gaithersburg. I'd like to share my personal perspective on how we got there. It all started for me late in 2014 at my very first meeting as a member of the Gaithersburg City Council, and my neighbors were restless. A group of Kentlands residents had arrived in force to complain about overcrowding at Rachel Carson Elementary School. Our kids have to eat lunch starting at 10:30. They walk outside in the snow to get from class to use a bathroom. We need a new school. I declared, by God, you're right. We need to fix this. But later, a more experienced elected official had a quiet chat with me. You don't want to go there. It's too hard. MCPS is difficult to work with and everything takes forever. I thought, then why are we here? Why get elected if we don't take on the hard jobs? Clearly, I was not cut out to be a career politician. During the next year or two, I learned a lot, including the fact that Rachel Carson was one of the most overcrowded schools in the county, but also that many other schools in Gaithersburg were very much over capacity. I had lunch with Rebecca Smodrowski, our district's Board of Education member, and she suggested setting up meetings with senior staff at MCPS. Rebecca made it happen. In fact, there were several meetings over the course of the next year, including Mayor Ashman and senior staff. We also had some land at Crown Farm that was given to the city by developer Aris Marderosian for use as a proposed high school. Finally, we met with the three chiefs: the MCPS Chief Operating Officer, the Chief of Staff to the Superintendent, and the Chief of Staff to the Board of Ed. Now, I was not the most senior person in the room, but after an hour, suddenly the chiefs turned to me and said, "What is your ask?" A lesson: always be ready with an ask. We need a new elementary school on the west side of town. We need a new school on the east side of town, and we need you to move forward with the Crown Farm High School. And MCPS came back to us with the plan. They would find a location for the new school on the east side. They would expand Dufif Elementary and redistrict some of the kids from Rachel Carson, and they would start the process for the Crown Farm High School. Hallelujah! Because nothing is ever easy, the selected location for the new school was quite controversial and led to a 2-year process of meetings, testimony, and negotiations with neighbors and MCPS. There was a very unhappy group that made their feelings known at the next election, costing several of us 15% of our votes, but we still managed to keep our seats. It's much easier to get elected if you don't do anything difficult. Clearly, I was not cut out to be a career politician. Is it worth it to try to do the slow, hard, risky things? You tell me. And tell Mayor Ashman, Rebecca Smondrowski, and the 3 other council members who had the courage to vote to approve the project despite the controversy. I tell this story hoping that more people will take on the hard projects. There's work to be done on housing, on transportation, on economic development. None of these are easy, so let's work together and get the hard things done.
Worth noting that it takes a new school in MCPS from concept to opening about 10 years. And that is when elected officials like Harris and his Gaithersburg colleagues support the effort. There are schools in the county like Poolsville High School and South Lake Elementary School that are getting their new buildings after decades of being in disrepair. Others, like Easton Middle School and Neilsville Middle School, are still waiting. In other local news, dispute has been brewing over Sugarloaf Mountain in Dickerson on the border of Frederick and Montgomery counties. Sugarloaf is the highest peak in the region. It sits at the confluence of the Potomac and Monocacy rivers and is a well-loved natural area with scenic overlooks and moderately challenging trails. The mountain gets about 250,000 visitors each year, including bikers and horse riders. While Montgomery County has protected Sugarloaf Mountain and its surrounding forests, farms, and rural communities with its agricultural reserve law, which preserves the western part of the county, Frederick does not have a similar law. From time to time, there have been proposals from private property owners in the area to build new and often large developments. Many area residents and conservation advocates have pushed for an ag reserve type law to cover the area within Frederick County. Over the last few years, the County Planning Commission has worked up the Sugarloaf Treasured Landscape Management Plan, which is now being debated for adoption. The nonprofit foundation that holds much of the property at the top of the mountain and most of the access areas has opposed Frederick County's land preservation plan and announced its intention to build a restaurant and gift shop at the top of the mountain, as well as to begin to charge admissions to climb the mountain itself. The nonprofit was set up in the 1940s by then owners Gordon and Louis Strong, who wanted to preserve the mountain and keep the area open to the public free of charge. The Strongs even refused Franklin Roosevelt's request to build a presidential retreat there. Roosevelt instead had to go to the Catoctin Mountains to build Camp David. This has set up a dispute between the trustees of the Stronghold Foundation and conservation advocates in the region. The Sugarloaf Citizens Association is opposing Stronghold's plans and wants Frederick County to adopt the land preservation rule to include the private property formerly belonging to the Strongs and now held in the nonprofit. We now have a fascinating contest over land use, private property rights, and the making of government policy, the stuff of local politics, really. Montgomery County approved its Ag Reserve Law in 1980, and it would have been equally fascinating to be present at that debate. Will the conservationists succeed? Will the Stronghold Foundation be grandfathered in the new plan? We will be following closely. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Niranjan Karnik, Director of the Institute of Juvenile Research in Chicago.
And if you do, you will hear their voices calling across the years. They're calling across the ocean. Yeah, they're calling across the land. And they will till we all come to understand. None of us are free. None of us are free. None of us are free if one of us is chained. None of us are free. There are people still in darkness. Yeah, they just can't see the light. If you don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right.
Niranjan Karnik, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks, Sunil. Nice to be here.
Tell me how youth mental health became separated from adult mental health and perhaps even from child mental health, right? How did that happen?
Some of your listeners are probably familiar with the name of Jane Addams, who established Hull House, which is where American social work was born. Around Jane Addams and that time period, there were a group of progressives who were doing a variety of things in Chicago. And one of the things that that group did was to establish the first juvenile court in the country. So they came to the conclusion that children who were doing criminal acts were doing things for different reasons, perhaps, than adults, and that they would be better served by having a separate process. And our court system now has come up with a variety of different models that kind of grew out of that moment. So there are, across the country, there are juvenile courts almost in every jurisdiction. There are now mental health courts. There's a variety of ways that this kind of form of judiciary was formed. Well, this institute that I lead actually was formed as a step from that juvenile court decision. So they started seeing the kids in the court, and then they wondered, why are these kids here, doing these criminal acts? And they decided that they needed to have more of a research approach, and also that there may be value in establishing a clinic to help address these kids' needs. So Chicago is home, the Institute for Juvenile Research is home to the first child mental health clinic in the country. And so it's around this moment that a lot of this came about. And medicine was very much involved in this from the very beginning. So the first director of the Institute for Juvenile Research was actually a neurologist who was studying children by the name of William Healy. And he really took a global approach to these kids, not only trying to understand kind of physiological or, more classically biomedical reasons for why these kids might be behaving this way, but also looking broadly at the kind of psychosocial context around these kids. And the Institute for all of its history has been very focused more on that latter end of things because it perhaps is more relevant.
So speak a little bit to both the biomedical side of youth mental health and what sort of is the physiological things that are happening and also the social psychological issues?
Yeah, so I mean, in the 19th century, there was a growing recognition that kids were not simply smaller adults, right? And that lesson is borne out in the discipline of pediatrics, right? Which comes out of this idea that children are different, children are dynamic, and they're changing.
Mainly around then brain development, correct? I mean, so how fast the brain is developing, how, what parts of the brain is developing, what are those things?
Yeah, I mean, we like to think of the brain as separate, but it's not. I mean, the brain is part of our bodies. In adolescence, one of the marked changes that we see that affects mental health is when children go through puberty. My mentor at Stanford used to say that he would tell parents, everything will change at puberty. Things will either get better or they'll get dramatically worse, with mental health. Like if the kid has emotional problems before puberty, we should expect changes.
One of the things I've read in a lot of the articles you sent me to read, right? They said that during the pandemic, there's been a rise of pessimism, of sadness among youth.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, yes, but there is always, pessimism and optimism are a balance, right? In people's lives. So what is that normal balance and how did COVID throw it out of whack?
I mean, I don't know that we know what the normal balance is. And again, these are broad trends, Sunil. For an individual kid, things would look different. But I think certainly, COVID stressed our society dramatically, right? And I think it should come as no surprise that kids responded, to this and are feeling, much more distressed about this. And I have to say, the politics and the way in which our society has become so fractured and fragmented, is really, that would lead to some of this as well.
Okay, but right. So the broad structural things that you are mentioning, right? COVID and the stresses it brought, but also guns or poverty. These are really broad structural things, right? They affect everybody. What is it in the youth category that sort of really has pushed them, above and beyond everything else, and our concern about that category is the most acute?
Well, okay, but one thing I want to kind of just say, when you say that these things happen to everybody, the structural things, well, they don't happen to everybody. Actually, they're not equally distributed, right? We know that actually these structural issues disproportionately impact communities of color and communities that are rural and impoverished. Those are
yes,
not evenly distributed phenomena.
Yes, I do agree. I mean, absolutely, you're correct. Right. So, but even within the families,
right.
though. Okay.
No, I get it. So within that, right, if we look at the why are youth potentially disproportionately impacted, right, over other groups or other age bands, right? Well, I think I have two responses to that. I mean, I think adults were impacted. I don't know that we are actually picking it up as well in terms of our assessments and our evaluations, right? And I think to some extent, adults may be a little bit more cushioned from this, by virtue of their other relationships and other factors, right? But I think it has to do with the fact that adolescents and young adults, like who are in that pocket that you're talking about, right? They're probably more sensitive to this because they lack the protections that come when you're a younger child. So why would a young child not be as sensitive to some of this? Well, they're generally, ensconced within some type of familial or protective unit, right? They're kind of dependent on that. Mm-hmm. Adolescents and young adults, because of that period of beginning to separate from the family unit, right? Mm-hmm. They start to have a more independent, sense, but they lack the adult coping mechanisms yet, right? So to me, it's unsurprising that band would be more affected. They don't have the tools of an adult, and they don't have the the connection as tightly to their family unit, right?
Sure. What tools do adults have that youth don't? Just, what are these tools?
Simplistically, I mean, Sunil, I think there's a variety of things. One, they've developed themselves more, right? They have a sense of themselves more. They have the ability to kind of filter the processes of the world, through that. Yeah, adults have more elaborate defense structures. If we think psychologically, like, we have the ability to kind of, put things up. Like a higher order defense is humor, right? An adult probably has better ability to deploy humor in the face of negative things, right? And that's considered a good defense to have for yourself, right? An adolescent might not have that. They haven't developed those skills, right? So there's that. And they also don't have as broad an ability to draw in support, perhaps, right? Because they're still learning. It takes time to develop those skills, right?
Right. No, I think that's a very important point.
And I would say it's harder to develop those skills in the middle of a pandemic, right? To the extent that some of our skills as adults are dependent on connecting to other people and having those abilities to have those conversations. When you're not in school and you don't have your friend circle, right? It's harder to do that, right? Who are they going to turn to, right? And I'll add one more thing, Sunil. One of the things that I observe a lot with young people is that they work really hard to protect their families, their parents or guardians from any kind of negative impact they have, and vice versa, right? I've worked in children's hospitals over my career, and one of the areas of work that I did a lot in is pediatric oncology. So we were addressing the psychological needs of families that were going through the kids having cancer. And the kids would often tell me things as a psychiatrist that they haven't told their parents. And they would tell me, don't tell my parents. I don't want them to know what I'm feeling because I'm worried about them. And the parents would tell me the same thing. Like, the parents are all fearful, but they don't want to tell the kid because they're afraid. And often a lot of my work was trying to bridge that and have them be able to have more open, honest conversations. And then they realize actually each is trying to do that for the other. So in the middle of a pandemic, I think a lot of that happened where these youth were suffering, but not wanting to tell their parents, but they also didn't have their friends or teachers to talk to because they weren't in that context. So they kind of suffered in silence. They suffered alone. And people will say, oh, well, they had social media, they got Facebook, but it's not quite the same type of conversation. And often in social media, they get a lot of negative feedback. They don't get the kind of support that one gets in person.
A lot of the research that I read to prepare for this interview around mental health depends on self-reporting surveys by various people. I know the deep limitations we have in polling, for example, because that is also self-reporting, right? So tell me, how does the mental health discipline deal with this problem of self-reporting about internal processes to the brain and a child?
With children, it's interesting because we do actually have other sources of information. It's different than actually doing research with adults. Clinically, Sunil, I often actually have the child do an assessment, and then I send the parents each, if they're two parents, I send them each an assessment. And then I will actually, if the parents are open to it, I will actually have the teacher do an assessment. And I get all these assessments back. And then I sit down and I look across them. And if I start to see consistent patterns, I tend to believe those symptoms or those aspects more are credible. When I start to see marked differences, so occasionally I'll have like one parent who sees that the kid is completely fine and another parent who sees all these problems. That's when I actually have to sit down and talk to them and say, okay, what are you perceiving and why is this so different, right? Because often there's something going on in terms of people's understanding or perception. And teachers tend to be pretty objective. It's interesting. Teacher data is actually really valuable because teachers have classrooms and groups of kids. So they have a kind of sense of normativity that comes over years of teaching. And they tend to be able to be really good about being able to pick out, kids that are really having difficulty versus those who are just going through, like a transition of some kind.
Mm. So I think you've mentioned this idea a few times. School is a good place. Teachers are very objective observers, so schools are good for most kids. One of the problems that I have seen in schools is that there is not enough mental health support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so in my county, right, at the elementary school level, I think a couple of schools have one school psychologist. We are very low staff.
This has been a long-standing problem in mental health. Is not only have we under-resourced mental health and underinvested in mental health, as you're pointing to, but the workforce in mental health is inadequate to the needs. And I have to say that I'm a little bit pessimistic about, the approaches that are currently being used to try and address that, because my perception is, and I've gone through this data, and I've talked to colleagues about it, we've spent 30, 40 years in terms of trying to build a workforce in mental health.
Right.
And this is across all the different disciplines of workforce development. If you include psychologists, psychiatrists, other counselors, we've made very little progress in that realm. The only field that has made some progress are nurse practitioners, mental health, psychiatric nurse practitioners. That field has grown to some extent. But if you do the projections, Sunil, you will see that these initiatives will never reach what this country needs in terms of workforce. And so I've come to the conclusion, actually, that we need to kind of think really outside the box on this. And we need to start to think about other ways to structure mental health that use perhaps non-professionals or lay people. And people get very upset with me in some circles when I posit this idea. But there is actually good research to show that first-line mental health interventions can be done with people who don't even have a high school education. People can be taught to do these interventions well.
How?
Oh, my friend Laura Murray, who's at Hopkins, she's been doing this. She's done, I don't know, half a dozen trials outside the US in very low resource settings. She's working right now in Ukraine, and they are training kind of local people, to do a basic manualized intervention for mental health. And she has great data and results on this. And I keep advocating, and she and I are working to try and implement some of her model here in the US, but it pushes up against our systems here, which require licensure, right? So the question is, how much can a layperson do without kind of crossing that line where they're practicing without a license, right? And it turns out, actually, people often who are non-specialists are actually better at delivering certain mental health interventions than some mental health professionals are. In some ways, we've been taught too much, in mental health, right? So there was a study where they asked, I think it was dermatologists, to do a depression screening, and they just gave them a rubric and said, do it this way, right? Well, they didn't know any better, so they just did what they were told, right? People in my field, like me, like when I see someone, I'm thinking through a lot of things, right? I've been taught all these different models. I can deploy them. I mean, there's value in that, right? But if you just want to do a depression screening, it's better just to follow the rubric, right? It's efficient. It gets to the point. So if you want to do it at a larger scale, there may be value in having non-specialists doing this, right? And then you reserve the specialist time to deal with the cases that don't respond to the basic treatment or that have really, particular needs that, obviously can't be done.
I suspect one of the problems you'll face if you try to do this, especially in youth mental health settings, schools and all, is privacy. And I think parents would get really upset if they found that their kids were being sent to some friendship bench with somebody that they don't know or hasn't been licensed.
Yeah, but I don't think privacy is really the issue with this, because all these folks can be trained to adhere to basic privacy rules. They're not doing this to talk to other people and share this around. It's not a gossipy thing to do, right?
Right.
and that's part of the training in terms of what they would go through. But the question is a good question about licensure and unlicensed folks, and what are the limits on this, right? But I think if folks want to wait for this magical mental health workforce to come about, they can wait. And there may be jurisdictions where they're going to say, no, we don't want these folks there. But I know that there are a lot of other jurisdictions in this country, a lot of localities where people would say, yes, please give us the tools, right? And Laura and I have had calls, from folks, because I've been a big proponent of Laura's models, and there was like a health system in Iowa that called and said, we desperately need something different here because we don't have enough providers, we don't have enough mental health care, and we need to, expand it.
One of the things I've wondered about is our cultural differences in how mental health issues manifest, and also how differences in uptake of services. So in reading a lot of the articles, I found that a lot of the respondents, are predominantly white. And so are there cultural issues that around how we recognize and treat mental health? And I want to say that I read somewhere that in China, at least according to this article, and it is a scholarly one, they said that the impact of COVID on youth, mental health impact of COVID in youth, was lesser than it was in Western countries. So can you talk to a little bit about the cultural aspects of this?
Sure. So let's take the first part of your question, which is about representation in the research. Mm-hmm. It's a huge problem in mental health research. Minorities and communities of color are underrepresented significantly in terms of the research literature. The folks from these communities are less likely to participate in clinical trials, for interventions, and this often creates a problem in terms of creating knowledge, about how to deploy new interventions, how to get new interventions. So that's a global problem, and some of us are trying to address that through the various channels that we have, and pushing our research leaders to better fund specific arms or require recruitment into these areas, and all of that costs more. It requires more expertise, more people to do that. So there's a price to be paid, but I think it is necessary in order to do this research well. Different cultural communities, of course, respond to both mental and physical health issues with their own kind of cultural background and cultural presentations. And in mental health, this is definitely the case. Families are different across cultures. Responses to stress are different, so we should expect that. And in fact, we have started to try and teach more about this in the curriculum to mental health professionals and to our trainees, to help make them aware and sensitive to this and be able to pick up on this. In terms of your note about China and COVID-19, a couple thoughts. One is that, China socially is a very different society in some ways, a much more communitarian society. So, could that have been part of what enabled them to weather this a little bit better? I don't know. I think I don't necessarily disbelieve the research. I think, what you're reading is true. I don't know that we actually understand the whys of that. China went through a much more aggressive shutdown of the society, and that may have pushed things in a certain direction, rapidly, right? Our experience of this pandemic has been more a series of crises, right? Rather than kind of a block of, difficulty and then coming out of it. I think China has really tried to do the latter there. They really completely shut down their economy in some sense. And that came at a cost, that they're paying, but that might have been changed the dynamic to a certain extent. In our society, Sunil, we are very fractured in terms of how we responded to the pandemic. There are people who don't believe that this is a pandemic. They think that this is all overwrought. And I think children are sensitive to those different factors. So I think where there's disagreement, perhaps that creates more stress because the children don't know, what to believe. They're seeing all these different messages on social media and on television, and people arguing about this every day, to mask or not mask.
In the Surgeon General's report, in Vivek Murthy's report on youth mental health, one of the things he said was that suicide ideation during the pandemic increased 51% for girls and 4% for boys.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot for the life of me figure out where the difference comes from.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we know with girls is that girls develop socially earlier than boys. Girls are developmentally kind of more advanced in some ways, which won't come as any surprise to the women who listen to your podcast. And this is something that we've known in mental health for a long time. So I think that kind of loss of social group may have disproportionately affected these girls. The other part of it is that in children, we tend to see, in child mental health, we divide kind of the behavioral kind of responses in two broad categories. And it's a little bit artificial, but it kind of works for us. We talk about internalizing disorders and externalizing disorders. And what we see is internalizing disorders are things like depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety. Those are the things that we feel within us, right? Externalizing disorders are like behavioral issues. So aggression, violence, pushing people, acting out in some ways, right? Tantrums. Those would be kind of, to some extent, externalizing. Tantrums could be internalizing too, but things that are outside. And broadly, what we see is that boys, especially at early developmental time periods, are more likely to do externalizing behaviors, whereas girls are more likely to do internalizing behaviors. And that distinction has been collapsing for some time. We've started to see more girls engaged in externalized behaviors than historically were the case. But to some extent, some of that is framed by societal expectations too.
So that was my question: is to what extent is this socially constructed?
It's probably both, right? Some of it is physiological, emotional development. Some of it is societal. Yeah.
We have strong stigma problems with mental health.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the research around youth mental health is linked to, associated with, however you want to call it, with sort of criminal behavior among kids. What does it say about this, how we stigmatize and where the origins of that stigma is?
Well, I mean, I agree. There is still stigma against mental health, but I don't know that it's as significant as it once was. I think that the stigma around mental health has been slowly dissipating, and it's due to a number of things. I mean, I think people talk about mental health more. We've had a number of celebrities and folks who've been very public about their mental health challenges. The Olympic swimmer, Michael Phelps, talking about his depression very publicly, right? And I think so those things have impact, and they have impact especially on children, who look up to often these types of public figures, and so doing some of this, I think has changed it. I mean, I think the origins of the discipline, are what they are, right? We need not be constrained by what happened 100 years ago. I think that we have moved ahead and we've tried to advance the field. I'm trying to reinvigorate the Institute for Juvenile Research to better serve the children of Illinois. Its original mission was to serve the kids of Chicago and Illinois. And so we're trying to, in some sense, relaunch and really look at the new era around mental health, which, now has this new space of digital mental health. How are we going to take care of kids in these online spaces? How are we going to engage them and treat them using these media? So, and I think in those spaces also, the destigmatization efforts have been, profound and effective. There are a lot of TikTokers out there who talk about their mental health and talk about treatment or lack of treatment, and those conversations, help kids in some ways to get to a better place. Hopefully, there's downsides to social media as well, but we'll try and promote the positives and move from there.
Niranjan Karnik, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll come back once the research becomes clear.
That may take a while, Sunil, so maybe we have interim updates, but thank you for having me on the show.
Yes, my daddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. My granddaddy was a miner. I'm gonna be a sunshiner. Ever since they closed the mine, ain't too much to do with your time, except wash your clothes in the creek and fold the flannel, till the gal come along with that solar panel. Yes, my daddy was a miner.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with child psychiatrist Niranjan Karnik? First, I didn't know the history of youth mental health as a discipline that grew out of the efforts of social workers to segregate juvenile offenders in the court system from the general population. Though psychiatry and psychology have moved greatly to reduce stigma, as Niranjan Karnik points out, those old roots in abnormality and criminal behavior and stigma seem, to me at least, to remain somewhat connected. If we are to break through stigma, we have to know this history. Second, don't underestimate the philosophy of individualism that underpins mental health thinking in the United States and the West more generally. As part of my reading assignment from Niranjan Karnik, I read research that showed lesser youth impact from COVID in China, where the disease and government action were both quite severe. Underneath that COVID impact is that adolescents separate from adults as part of the developmental process. The degree and quality of this separation is surely culturally determined and could very well explain the difference in mental health concerns in different cultural settings. For example, Asian societies expect youth to remain a part of the family unit for much longer than in the West. One upshot of this is that youth mental health in immigrant communities in the United States and in Montgomery County, where kids are American while their parents hold on to old cultural ideas about family, youth mental health problems tend to be neglected and underreported. Third, in this context, elevated reporting of mental health concerns is not entirely a bad thing. Is there overreporting? Probably. Given staffing and budgets, we should expect there to be a gap between demand and supply. But that is better than underreporting. Because mental health is a mind and body problem, biomedical, physiological, and psychosocial, Both expectation setting and open reporting of mental health concerns are in themselves useful tools in addressing the issue. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Montgomery County climate band, the Sunshiners. Kip and Martin on guitars and vocals, Rick Sullivan on vocals and guitar, and Jeffrey Weisner on the double bass. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
We know it's close at hand. Our mother, she is pleading. I've had all I can stand. Rivers of oil, blood and tears, darkest evil, deepest fears, ExxonMobil and their friends, this web of lies they defend. Truth, time is coming. We know it's close at hand. Our mother, she is pleading. I've had all I can stand. Their own dark warnings they would not heed. They took the money, they chose the greed. They pumped that oil into the skies. They filled our heads with their lies. Truth, time is coming. We know it's close at hand. Our mother